It is no secret that companies make a lot of money by selling military hardware to other nations. But while we often focus on the economic benefits, there are geopolitical interests at play as well that can really drive these sales, as customer and export nations negotiate on each deal. To talk about these dynamics and the geopolitical influence that comes through military sales, I sit down with Piers Register, who wrote a paper on justice for the Freeman Air and Space Institute. Why do we then, and with that I'm sort of lumping together all the Western countries, NATO specifically, why do we sell military equipment to countries whose intentions we're just not that sure of?
Typically, Western countries do have very rigorous processes around arms exports, ITAR regulations, US foreign military sales, and the like. The big issue is really it gets harder to predict long-term geostrategic trends, and Iran during the Shah's time is a good example of that. So if we go back to the early 1970s, really Iran was essentially what Saudi Arabia is to the Western world today, and almost any aircraft system they wanted, they pretty much got. So F4s, F14s, they very nearly got F16s if it wasn't for the revolution, and those inevitably found their way to Israel. That's why we have situations in the Gulf today where you have American F-35s facing off against Iranian F4s, which is quite bizarre. But yeah.
And what is the initial intention then of these sales? Are they used to support mainly the regional allies, or are they used more in case of let's strengthen this one regional power in order to then deter perhaps a potential adversary?
Well, military balance definitely comes into it. So, ideally, you want to maintain both a qualitative and quantitative advantage over your opponent. In the present day, Taiwan is a really good example of that. So, China's been very, very effective at a great political campaign against dissuading Western powers, in particular, from delivering a new aircraft to Taiwan. So, what we've seen since the 1990s is the Air Force on Taiwan been steadily losing its qualitative edge vis-a-vis China, while in turn China has been rapidly increasing its number of fourth generation and then fifth generation aircraft to the point where now, 30 years later, the Air Force on Taiwan would very likely struggle in case of an air battle with China.
I mean, that's a good example of sort of a country failing to receive the level of military support that they need because of other states influencing the geopolitical situation and trying to dissuade countries from exporting anything to said state. But what are some examples where you would say this is a state being influenced by a military state, as far as we can tell, of course, in the public domain?
Yeah, but as you rightly allude to, a lot of these discussions are very sensitive. They do occur behind closed doors. So there was when Sweden acceded to NATO. We don't know the full details of that, but Hungary, for example, did for-time protest Sweden's accession to NATO, which was a bit probably uncomfortable after Turkey put aside its objections to Sweden join NATO. And there was some kind of deal that took place where Sweden agreed to supply and maintain a certain number of Gripen jets for the Hungarian Air Force, which the Hungarians were already operating. Again, a lot of that occurred behind closed doors. We don't know the full details of that. But one example that has been very much playing out in the public sphere has been the long-running saga with Turkey and F-35. So, as I'm sure you'll be aware, Turkey was a partner nation in the F-35 program. They were supposed to receive them, and then they decided to purchase the S-400 surface-to-air missile system, at which point the United States withdrew its approval for Turkey to receive F-35. And even though that occurred several years ago now, it's still a long-running discussion. And for the Turks, it's definitely becoming a bit more of a pertinent issue. We've seen S-400 hasn't performed as well as one might expect in live real-world circumstances in Ukraine. And the Greek Air Force is now purchasing F-35 of itself, Rafael. So likely in the next couple of years or so, we may see Turkey basically decide, well, actually, do we really want to hold on to S-400, or do we want to maybe come to some kind of deal where we can get F-35. So it will be a very interesting a situation to see develop.
Publicly, most of these military sales are always equated to sort of the monetary value behind it, the economic gain, and that's why all these weapon systems are sold throughout the world. That's sort of the public image that we have there. Um, in how far does this economic opportunity outweigh or influence the political considerations that are behind it?
Well, Chris, it's always a bit of a balance between the two, and when I was still writing the paper, it was actually very hard to sometimes quantify that. But yeah, the two always play a role in some respects. So if you're a nation state, you have a very significant military aircraft industry, it's really in your interest to see both companies prevail. So a big example in the United States is Boeing and Lockheed Martin. When Lockheed Martin won what was then the Joint Strike Fighter program, Boeing really had its work cut out for it. And that extends even to the winner as well, Lockheed Martin. So Lockheed Martin has been trying very hard to extend the production of its F-16 offerings by offering the F-16 V program to countries which may want to purchase F-35, which as more F-35s have been produced, the item gets cheaper. But again, that may not be the case for all countries. So again, a big thing we may see develop over the next few years is Lockheed Martin making efforts to market the F-16 to India, for example, as the F-21, and making very interesting offers to, say, move the production line from the United States to India in order to sweeten that deal, if you like. And that doesn't occur in a vacuum as well. The Indians have for quite a while purchased Russian military equipment, but again, how long the Ukraine conflict continues on, will Russia be able to fulfill orders for very large Indian purchases? That's really a question in doubt. We don't really know the answer to that. So, yeah, it might be really interesting to see what the Indians do in the next 3 to 5 years when it comes to that.
And in what ways then? I mean, we've been looking at this mainly from sort of the exporter's perspective on the political side and the economic side. But in what ways can then a customer, influence an exporter to gain access to certain military equipment?
Yep. So again, military aircraft are getting increasingly expensive over time. It's very difficult for a single nation state, even sometimes one as rich as the United States, to go it alone. The UK, for example, partners so with Sweden to some respect on the Gripen, and yeah, and again, it's now a case where even if you do have very deep pockets, if you're developing a fighter aircraft, you have to partner with other states. So what we're almost certainly going to see over the next decade or so is just this increased pattern of partnerships between different countries, like we've seen in the UK with the Tempest program, for example. Um, Another way is also funding upgrades. So this is one that isn't as well known and it doesn't get talked about as much, but it's equally important. And the Gulf states are very interesting case study in that. So even before we started having the F-16V, for example, the UAE had the F-16EF. They were the sole operators of that particular model of F-16. And that's, again, it's a question of how deep your pockets go. If you are dealing with a very wealthy client state who will be willing to fund very high-end upgrades that even the host nation doesn't have themselves, particularly around things like avionics, the radar, bespoke weapon systems, things like that, those countries could afford to pay the manufacturer to actually integrate those systems onto the aircraft. And then that then has a knock-on effect later on. So, for example, with the F-15, Saudi Arabia paid for quite a lot to see the F-15E baseline model upgraded to their specifications through initially the S model, which I think was slightly downgraded, but then the SA model, which was then upgraded. But then those developments then fed back and influenced the EX model, which now the US Air Force is now purchasing. So it's a very interesting reverse influence dynamic where normally you'll see the host nation will be um, basically influencing the client state, as the US may do it Turkey or Sweden may do it Hungary. But in the Gulf states, it's been the opposite. They've managed to influence the host nation, supply nation, in order to basically facilitate aircraft development. So it's really a fascinating case study, and they do touch on this to a little bit on the paper.
So, I mean, we can always, and you see this with military sales a lot, that it take the cynical view, of course. We already touched upon the economic side. But once you sell something, then basically it's in the hands of another state, and what they then do with it is out of your control. And I think that the example that you brought up earlier with Iran is one of those key examples that is always brought up of saying, like, you sell weapons, and then suddenly this country goes through a tremendous political, socio-political change, and suddenly they're no longer the ally that they used to be, at least in terms of geopolitics, if not values. However, how do you then retain sort of influence? Are there sort of mechanisms in play where you have contractors, long tail industrial support, where you can try to retain that influence?
Yep, it's again, it is difficult to basically maintain that influence once you've handed over the weapon system. I recall several years ago when the F-35 was in its early stages, there was discussion again, very technical, that potentially if the that kind of scenario happened, because F-35 is so interlinked through things like a logistics network. It was ALIS back then. I think they may have replaced it since then. That potentially the United States could potentially just turn off that support. And then essentially you've got an F-35 where you're not getting upgrades. You can't really get the bits and bobs you need to get up in the air, to put it very simply speaking. With the Iranians, yeah, they've had issues with maintaining their very increasingly antiquated kit, and it's absolutely incredible that they're managing to put up say for example a free ship flight of F4 Deltas up in the air, which you may have seen recently, which is amazing to see if you're a fan of the Phantom. But as to its actual combat application against American aircraft flying F-22s, F-35s, that's probably a bit more questionable. But yeah, it's really your main influence is really that supply network, and the Ukrainians have found that problematic as well. So when Russia went into Crimea in 2014, they had issues with getting deep maintenance that they required on their aircraft, because, well, the country that does that deep maintenance is now the state that's invaded you, and they're not going to perform that maintenance. And so, yeah, it very much comes down to logistics and supply chains, really, when it comes to influence. So once you've handed over your weapon system, beyond any political measures you could potentially exert.
And then we've been mainly talking about the aircraft itself and the systems and the supply network for that aircraft. But are there any other means of influence in the air domain, let's say, for states, with delivering additional weapon systems outside the initial contract, basing perhaps pilot training?
So those industrial partnerships that we've previously talked about, that's one way. So a very interesting example, again, sticking with Ukraine, is a few years back, Saudi Arabia and Ukraine agreed to cooperate on a transport aircraft, and it was the AN-132, if I remember right. And yeah, that was a very interesting system where the two states were collaborating with each other, and it was going to be a modified version of the AN-32. But then that program got suspended in 2019, if I remember right. I think, again, political issues. Saudi Arabia was getting a bit closer to Russia. Ukraine didn't like that. They didn't like that, and they basically suspended the program. But another way you could do, and again, we don't see this too often, but it does happen, is charitable donations of aircraft. We saw it maybe a bit more during the Cold War period. So when we had the old East v West dynamics, it was very tempting to say, "Oh, we'll give you very preferential preferential loan treatments to purchase Mi-24s, for example, or we'll donate these old aircraft that we're not using, for example. Again, you don't see that very often, so I did look for some examples for my paper. There was, I think China donated a light transport aircraft to Afghanistan before the government fell to the Taliban, and there's not a lot I could find online about what happened to those aircraft, but they were delivered, and that was a little bit of transport aircraft and trainer aircraft are very ideal items to donate if you do want to do that, because they're among some of the cheapest platforms you can get, relatively easy to maintain, and a good thing as well is it gives you a bit of a foot in the door, if you like. So if you have a trainer aircraft for a particular country system, that then leads you to say, oh, well, I'll buy your light attack aircraft, and I'll then buy your fighter aircraft, and so on and so forth. So we do see that in terms of influence.
And I mean, that this also goes into this, what you've been saying, into this idea that if you buy one system, you sort of buy into the whole military system. We see this very much sort of with the Soviet and then the Western type of fighters, where when you have one sort of fleet, and a lot of Eastern European countries, of course, had to transition then to NATO spec aircraft, that there really is almost a generational thing in the armed forces of having to transition. So once you buy something, you're almost obligated to buy again from the same provider. Have you been seeing those trends?
In an extent, so again, we don't see it as much nowadays. The Israeli Air Force is a great historical example. They started off with a wide variety, shall we say, of aircraft that they initially started operating with. Then they moved to mainly French platforms, and then when France became a bit more closer to Arab states, the Israelis then moved over to American systems, which they've then maintained their allegiance to, if you could call it. Not the best word, but yeah, they're still mainly an American supplied and operating air force, and operate with those tactics. But yeah, it's incredibly difficult to if you change the system and the country that supplies you, it's very difficult to change, and we're seeing that in Ukraine at the moment. So, like, the Ukrainians, to their credit, they did try to get ahead of the game a bit early. So, a few years before Russia invaded a second time, they did issue a modernization plan. They did say, oh, we want to buy F-16V, we want to buy F-15. But at that time, Western countries were like, no, we don't want to provoke Russia, so we're not going to supply anything like that. And now we have this situation where we're now hurriedly trying to get them equipped with earlier model F-16s, and now we're talking they might eventually go to Gripen, they might eventually go to F-16V. But yeah, these things take a lot of time. It's not like 70 years ago where you could receive a system. And there are incredible stories from that time period, as you've covered in previous videos on World War II. Pilots would literally jump in an aircraft, having never flown it before, and just fly circuits. You can't do that now. To many respects, it takes a long period of time.
We talk about the West. Of course, there are different states and different providers. And are there any sort of cases where you can really tell that it's not just a competition or like an attempt to influence another country, but it's also in the alliance itself a bartering process of who actually gets to export certain things? Because in a lot of planes, components are shared, and the origin of that component then requires basically to green light the export of the whole system if you only have a few components in there in that aircraft.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, that's a fantastic question, Chris, and it's a really good point. So, the first one that comes to mind is probably Argentina. They went for quite a long time. They were looking for a replacement for their main fighter aircraft, and the UK, for certain historical reasons, kept blocking exports of certain aircraft, not because they had control over the whole system, but because small British companies owned components in that aircraft, particularly the ejection seat, if I remember right, made by Martin Baker, a British company. So the Argentines were looking, for example, at one point F-16 before the current agreement that got vetoed. and they were looking at Chinese aircraft as well at one point. And again, it just became this long run-in situation where they kept trying to basically sign deals, talking to various different countries, and little, again, a lot of the stuff happens behind closed doors. Little snippets kept coming out in Air Force's monthly Flight International. And and it's very interesting that they finally managed to agree F-16 when I presume Martin Baker ejection seats. So clearly something has gone on behind the scenes there, where it's like, yeah, that's okay. But yeah, it is a good point. So we do focus a lot in public discourse on the larger companies, Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, Saab. But one thing that we don't talk about a lot is behind all those big manufacturers, there's a much wider and broader aerospace industry, smaller names that most people will never even have heard of, producing smaller components. And if you have a key critical component that you need to produce and you can basically interfere with that, that could be an issue. And even very large superpowers like the United States have had problems.
Yeah, that's one of those example that's sort of tells us why it often takes so many years to actually get something exported, and why actually the process behind it is in many ways quite rigorous, even beyond sort of the economic intentions that we might assume there to be. So Piers, thank you very much for your research and for the article. It was very interesting to read that, and I'll obviously be putting the link in the description as well for everybody to check that out. And thank you very much for giving us your time, and have a good one.
No worries, thanks, Chris. And keep up the good work. Likewise with channel. Big fan. So.
To learn more about this and other issues in military aerospace, check out the link in the description to the full publication catalog of the Freeman Air and Space Institute. A big thank you here to Piers Register for his time and chatting about this subject, and as always, have a great day and see you in the sky.